When America created the petrodollar system in 1974, the arrangement by which Saudi Arabia priced all its oil in US dollars and recycled the surplus into American treasury bonds. It solved a specific problem with elegant precision. The United States had just abandoned the gold standard in 1971, removing the physical anchor that had given the dollar its global credibility since Bretton Woods in 1944. The petrodollar replaced the gold anchor with an oil anchor. As long as all nations needed dollars to buy oil, global demand for dollars was structurally guaranteed regardless of American economic performance. For 50 years, the system held. China has identified its structural weakness and has been engineering a replacement with the patient, systematic precision it applied to becoming the world's dominant rare earth processor. This episode is about how far that engineering has progressed. The petrodollar's structural weakness is simple to identify and difficult to address. It depends on a single country, Saudi Arabia, continuing to price its oil in dollars and recycling its surpluses into American financial markets. If Saudi Arabia stops doing either of those things, the mechanism's foundation shifts. Saudi Arabia stopped being America's primary oil supplier when the shale revolution of the 2010s made American domestic production sufficient. What remained was the pricing convention and the financial recycling. In 2023, Saudi Arabia publicly stated it was open to accepting yuan for oil sales. In 2024, the first yuan-denominated Saudi oil trades were completed. The convention is cracking. Not collapsing, but cracking, for the first time in 50 years. To understand why China cares so much about the petrodollar, you need to understand what the dollar's reserve currency status actually costs China. China is the world's largest oil importer. It purchases approximately 10 million barrels per Dalton Y. Every barrel it buys must be paid for in dollars. To obtain those dollars, China must either earn them through exports or borrow them from American financial markets, which means Chinese purchasing power is partly mediated by American monetary policy. When the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, the dollar strengthens and China's oil import costs rise in yuan terms, even if the dollar oil price hasn't changed. This is the tax that dollar reserve currency status imposes on every country that must buy oil. China pays more of this tax than anyone else. It has been working to eliminate it for 20 years. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus the newer members added in 2023 and 2024, represent a formal institutional framework for dollar alternatives. At the 2023 BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, member nations formally discussed the development of a BRICS currency or payment system that would allow trade between member nations without dollar intermediation. The discussion was not concluded. The technical and political challenges of a common currency for nations with economies as different as India's and Russia's are enormous. But the institutional commitment to developing alternatives was stated publicly at the highest level of all member governments. The question is no longer whether BRICS will develop dollar alternatives, it is how fast, and whether America will notice in time to respond. Russia's role in the Dedollarization movement deserves specific attention, because it went from theoretical to operational after February 2022, when the United States and European allies froze approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions following the Ukraine invasion. They demonstrated something that every non-Western government immediately absorbed. Dollar-denominated reserves held in Western financial institutions can be seized. The dollar's safety as a reserve asset depends on the political relationship with Washington. For countries that do not have a reliable political relationship with Washington, which is most of the world, this demonstrated that dollar reserves are not a safe store of value. They are a political instrument. The reserve calculation for every central bank in the world changed in February 2022. China's strategy for controlling the minerals of the energy transition is the most consequential industrial policy decision of the 21st century, and it was made quietly, systematically over 20 years while the Western world was focused on the war on terror, the financial crisis, and the shale revolution. The strategy was not secret. It was announced in Chinese government documents, visible in Chinese investment patterns, and noted by a small number of Western analysts who found it difficult to get political attention for what they were seeing. The core of the strategy was straightforward: identify the minerals that the energy transition would require, secure control of their processing and supply chains before the competition intensified, and establish Chinese companies as the dominant global processors of those materials. Rare earth elements. a group of 17 metallic elements with specific electromagnetic and chemical properties, are essential components of the permanent magnets used in electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, and advanced defense systems, including guided missiles and aircraft sensors. China controls approximately 60% of global rare earth mining, but 87% of global rare earth processing. The processing dominance is what matters strategically, because the raw ore extracted elsewhere must be processed into usable materials, and China controls almost all of the world's processing capacity. In 2010, during a territorial dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, China temporarily reduced rare earth exports to Japan. Japanese electronics and defense manufacturing, which depends on Chinese rare earth processing, experienced severe disruption within weeks. China demonstrated its leverage. Then, it waited. China's mineral strategy extended far beyond rare earth processing. Beginning in the early 2000s, Chinese state-owned enterprises, backed by the government's sovereign wealth funds and the Belt and Road Initiative, began systematically acquiring mining rights and processing facilities for the specific minerals the energy transition would require. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, which contains over 70% of the world's known cobalt reserves, Chinese companies now control approximately 15 of the 20 largest cobalt mining operations. In Chile and Argentina, which together hold over half the world's lithium reserves, Chinese companies have made multi-billion-dollar investment agreements, securing long-term supply access. In Indonesia, which holds the world's largest nickel reserves, Chinese companies have built the processing facilities that convert Indonesian ore into battery-grade materials. The Western response to Chinese mineral dominance began approximately 5 to 10 years too late, and is now being conducted under urgent pressure that China is not operating under. The United States Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 included significant provisions for domestic critical mineral supply chain development and incentives for non-Chinese sourcing. The European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act of 2023 set targets for domestic mining and processing of strategic minerals. Australia, Canada, and Japan have entered into critical mineral partnership agreements with the United States. These are all serious policy responses. They are also responses to a 20-year strategic lead that cannot be closed in 5 years. The specific bottleneck processing capacity takes a decade to build, requires specialized expertise that is concentrated in China, and involves environmental permitting processes in Western countries that routinely extend project timelines by years. The most important thing to understand about China's mineral strategy is that it is not primarily a military strategy or even an economic strategy. It is an energy strategy. China's leadership concluded in the 2000s that the energy transition was inevitable, that it would require specific minerals, and that controlling those minerals would give China the same structural leverage over the post-oil economy that oil gave the United States and Saudi Arabia over the post-gold standard economy of 1974. The parallel to the petrodollar is exact. If you control the material that powers the world's energy system, you control the leverage. China decided it would control that material before anyone else decided it was worth controlling. The yuan's internationalization, China's effort to make the renminbi a global trading and reserve currency, has been underway since 2009, when the People's Bank of China launched its first currency swap agreements with foreign central banks. By 2024, China had currency swap agreements with over 40 countries, totaling the equivalent of approximately $500 billion in yuan liquidity. These agreements allow bilateral trade to be settled in yuan without requiring either party to first convert to dollars. They are the financial infrastructure of Dedollarization, built one agreement at a time, over 15 years, with the quiet consistency that characterizes every element of China's long-term strategic planning. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange, the NI, launched its yuan-denominated crude oil futures contract in March 2018. The contract was designed to give oil producers who sell to China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and increasingly Gulf states the ability to price that oil directly in yuan, receiving payment in China's currency rather than the dollar. In its first year, the NI traded approximately 200 million barrels, a small fraction of global oil trade, but a functional alternative that had never previously existed. By 2024, the NI's daily trading volume had grown significantly. Russia, which must find alternatives to dollar settlement following sanctions, routes a growing proportion of its oil sales through yuan settlement. Iran, also under dollar sanctions, prices its sales to China in yuan, the infrastructure of non-dollar oil trade is operational. Saudi Arabia's 2023 acknowledgment that it was open to yuan-denominated oil sales was the most significant development in petrodollar history since the 1974 original agreement. Saudi Arabia is not Russia or Iran. It is not under sanctions. It is not facing pressure to find dollar alternatives. Its openness to yuan pricing is a freely made strategic choice, driven by the recognition that China is now its largest oil customer, and that the customer's preferred payment currency has value as a relationship tool. The specific transaction that followed, a Chinese state oil company purchasing Saudi crude in yuan, was small in volume but enormous in signal. If Saudi Arabia can price oil in yuan, any producer can. The 1974 convention that oil is only priced in dollars rests entirely on Saudi Arabia's participation. Saudi Arabia is reconsidering its participation. The gold factor in Dedollarization deserves attention because it reveals a preference that goes beyond yuan advocacy. Central banks globally purchased more gold in 2022 and 2023 than in any years since 1967. The largest buyers were the central banks of China, India, Turkey, and several other nations with complicated relationships with Washington. Gold purchases are not an endorsement of yuan settlement. Gold is nobody's currency. They are a hedge against dollar risk, a reserve asset that cannot be frozen by American financial sanctions, cannot be devalued by American monetary policy, and does not require the political relationship with Washington that dollar holdings implicitly require. The gold buying is the reserve calculation changing, documented in central bank balance sheets, not in diplomatic statements. The honest assessment of de-dollarization in 2025 is that it is real but not yet decisive. The dollar remains the dominant global reserve currency. It accounts for approximately 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, down from 71% in 2000 but still dominant. Dollar-denominated oil trade still accounts for over 80% of global oil transactions. The dollar's infrastructure, the depth of American financial markets, the SWIFT payment system, the legal framework of U.S. contract law, is not being dismantled. It is being worked around incrementally by a growing number of actors who have specific reasons to prefer alternatives. The trend is clear. The timeline is not, but the direction of travel has not been ambiguous since February 2022. China's Belt and Road Initiative, announced by Xi Jinping in 2013 and involving infrastructure investment in over 140 countries, is the most ambitious geopolitical project since the Marshall Plan. Its explicit objectives include improving trade connectivity, developing infrastructure in partner countries, and building the physical and financial linkages of a China-centered global trade network. Its strategic objective, less explicitly stated but visible in every major BRICS project, is to build the physical infrastructure through which trade can occur without dollar intermediation, without American financial system participation, and without the geopolitical conditions that American financial access typically imposes. The BRICS is the material infrastructure of the alternative order that de-dollarization requires. The BRICS financial architecture is as significant as its physical construction. China's development banks, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, have extended more development financing to lower and middle-income countries than the World Bank, the IMF, and all major Western development banks combined. In some estimates, this financing is typically denominated in yuan or in the local currency of the recipient, explicitly building non-dollar financial relationships. The terms have been criticized as creating debt dependency, the debt trap diplomacy critique, though the evidence for systematic intentional predatory lending is disputed by researchers who have examined specific cases. What is not disputed is that Chinese development finance creates a financial relationship between China and the recipient country that Western finance does not provide. The American response to the BRICS, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, announced at the G7 in 2022 with a stated commitment of $600 billion, is the most significant Western infrastructure financing initiative since the Marshall Plan instated ambition. Its actual disbursement has been substantially lower than its announced commitment, primarily because Western infrastructure finance operates through private investment mechanisms that require commercial returns, rather than through state-directed development banks that can accept lower returns in exchange for strategic relationship building. The governance structures that make Western democracies more accountable also make them slower to deploy capital at the speed and scale that strategic competition requires. This is a genuine structural constraint, not a failure of will. The multipolar energy order that is emerging is not a simple replacement of American dominance with Chinese dominance. It is a genuine diffusion of energy leverage across multiple actors: the United States, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the countries that hold the minerals of the energy transition. This diffusion is the most complex geopolitical environment the world has operated in since before WWE, when multiple great powers competed without a clear hegemon. The complexity creates risks, the coordination failures that allow crises to escalate, the miscalculations that occur when multiple actors are simultaneously pursuing their own advantage. But it also creates opportunities for countries that had no leverage in the bipolar or unipolar eras to develop independent capacity. The Global South's newfound willingness to play multiple sides is the most direct political expression of this shift. The United States' response to de-dollarization and Chinese mineral strategy has been substantial, but it has been reactive rather than anticipatory. The Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the Critical Mineral Strategy, the PGII. These are all significant policy commitments. They are also all responses to a Chinese strategic lead of 15 to 20 years. The most important question for American strategic positioning is not whether it can respond. It clearly can, but whether it can respond fast enough, and whether the democratic political process that governs American policy can generate the consistency of strategic commitment that China's state-directed model produces across multiple election cycles. That question is not answered by any of the current policy initiatives. It is answered by what happens in the next decade. The petrodollar system's most significant benefit for ordinary Americans is one that most Americans have never heard explained. It allows the United States to borrow money from the rest of the world at lower interest rates than its economic fundamentals would otherwise justify. Because every country needs dollars to buy oil, there is permanent structural demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, the safest dollar-denominated asset available. This permanent demand keeps American government borrowing costs lower than they would otherwise be, which means lower mortgage rates, lower car loan rates, lower business borrowing costs, lower credit card interest, and a federal government that can run deficits larger than any other country could sustain without a currency crisis. The petrodollar subsidy is invisible in American daily life, but it is embedded in every loan rate Americans pay. If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, partially or substantially, the most immediate consequence for Americans would be higher interest rates on everything: mortgages, auto loans, credit cards, and government debt. The federal government would need to pay more to borrow, which means either higher taxes, reduced spending, or higher inflation to service its debt. The transition would not be a sudden crisis. Reserve currency status does not disappear overnight. It is more likely to be a gradual erosion over 1 to 2 decades that produces a slow, persistent increase in the cost of American borrowing that no single administration can easily explain or address. The analogy is Britain after WE, a gradual loss of sterling's global dominance that produced a generation of economic constraint. The process is slow. The endpoint, if reached, is significant. The geopolitical consequence of dollar decline is more immediate than the economic one. Dollar dominance gives the United States a coercive instrument that no other country possesses: the ability to cut any country or company off from the dollar-based global financial system. American secondary sanctions, which penalize non-American companies for doing business with sanctioned countries, work only because access to the dollar system is something most companies cannot afford to lose. If the dollar system becomes optional, if yuan-based alternatives become large enough, secondary sanctions lose their bite. Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and other sanctioned countries have been actively building dollar alternative trade networks for precisely this reason. The sanction as a foreign policy instrument is only as powerful as the dollar's irreplaceability. That irreplaceability is declining. The energy transition adds a specific complexity to the de-dollarization story because the minerals of that transition are priced in dollars too. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements are currently traded in dollar-denominated markets. If de-dollarization proceeds significantly, there will be pressure to price these minerals in whatever currency replaces or supplements the dollar in global trade. China, which processes most of these minerals, has an obvious interest in pricing them in yuan. If China succeeds in making yuan the pricing currency for both oil and the minerals of the energy transition, the structural demand for yuan becomes what the structural demand for dollars was in 1974. The energy transition, if it is Chinese, does not end the petrodollar's logic. it transfers it to the petro-yuan. In episode 10, the series finale, we close the loop from 1914 to 2026. The episode asks the question that this series has been building toward: who will control the energy of the transition to renewables? And will that competition look like the oil wars of the past century? It examines the specific geopolitical confrontations happening right now: Israel, Iran, US-China in the South China Sea, Russia, Europe, through the lens this series has built. And it asks whether the pattern that has governed resource competition for 110 years is capable of producing a different outcome when the resource changes from oil to lithium. The answer matters for everyone, and it is the episode that closes the series. 9 episodes and the architecture is complete, from the original oil war of 1914 through WWE, the Cold War, the Iranian Revolution, the Iraq Wars, the Shale Revolution, and now the Dedollarization challenge. This series has traced a single continuous thread: whoever controls the energy controls the leverage. That logic has not changed in 110 years. What has changed is the material, from coal to oil, from oil to the minerals of the energy transition. And what has changed is the cast of actors, from the British Empire to the United States to a multipolar world, in which China has positioned itself to be the dominant processor of every material that the next energy era requires. The question for episode 10 is whether the pattern itself can change. The Dedollarization story is not a simple story about American decline. It is a story about a transition from a unipolar financial order, where one country's currency served as the global medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account, to a multipolar one, where multiple currencies and multiple actors compete for that role. The transition is disruptive, uncertain, and potentially dangerous, because the coordination mechanisms that manage the bipolar Cold War order and the unipolar post-Cold War order are not designed for multipolarity. The institutions built at Bretton Woods in 1944, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, all were designed for a world with American financial hegemony at their center. They are operating in a world that no longer has that center, and the institutions capable of managing a multipolar world do not yet exist. This is episode 9 of our series on oil and world power. We have traced the thread from the first oil war of 1914 to the Dedollarization challenge of 2025. In episode 10, the series finale, we close the loop. We examine the specific confrontations of the present: the Israel-Iran exchange of airstrikes in 2025, the South China Sea mineral competition, the Russia-Europe energy war's lasting effects, and the fundamental question that this entire series has been building toward: is the competition for the energy of the next century, the minerals of the transition, going to look like the oil wars of the last century? Or is there a different outcome available, if the actors involved choose to pursue it? The answer determines not just the future of energy, but the future of the international order itself. Episode 10. 9 episodes, 110 years, 1 pattern. The series has traced oil and power from the moment it mattered to the moment it is being replaced, and shown that the replacement doesn't change the pattern, it just changes the material. The next episode is the finale, and it is the most important one, because it is about now, not 1914, not 1945, not 1973. Now the confrontations happening on your screen are downstream of every episode in this series. Episode 10 shows you exactly how to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. And the next episode is the one you've been watching 9 episodes to understand. Do not miss it.